The blood-red sunset cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Miles City, Montana, as Francine Jameson clutched her bruised wrist and hurried toward the general store. Whispers followed her like vultures, the townsfolk's eyes burning into her back with accusations she couldn't escape. Her husband Theodore's reputation as the town's most ruthless businessman had become her burden too, though the bruises hidden beneath her high-necked blouse told a different story than the one Miles City believed. It was 1883, and the Northern Pacific Railroad had transformed this once quiet cattle town into a bustling hub of commerce and opportunity. For most, at least. For Francine, the prosperity had only brought more misery, more control, more nights spent cowering in the corner of their grand house on the hill. She kept her gaze fixed on the wooden boardwalk ahead, ignoring the hushed comments that followed her progress. There goes Mrs. Jameson. You know what they say about her. Cold as ice, that one, perfect match for Theodore. Heard she pushed the Wilkins family out of their homestead so Theodore could expand his holdings. Francine's throat tightened. The Wilkins family had been friends once, before Theodore's schemes had driven them away. She'd smuggled them food and money before they left, but no one knew that. No one knew anything real about her at all. The general store bell jingled as she entered, the familiar scent of coffee, leather, and tobacco momentarily calming her racing heart. Mr. Peterson, the elderly shopkeeper, barely glanced up from his ledger. Mrs. Jameson, he acknowledged stiffly. What can I help you with today? Just some flour and sugar, please, she said softly, and perhaps some coffee if you have it. Peterson moved mechanically, gathering her items without meeting her eyes. The store had fallen silent upon her entrance, the other patrons suddenly finding great interest in examining canned goods or bolt cloth. As Peterson tallied her purchases, the store door swung open, bringing with it a gust of wind and dust and a stranger. Francine kept her eyes down, but she could feel the shift in the room's atmosphere. The newcomer's spurs jingled softly with each deliberate step. Afternoon, came a deep, unfamiliar voice. Looking for supplies before heading out to the rocking queue, Francine risked a glance. The man stood tall, his broad shoulders tapering to a lean waist. His face was weathered by sun and wind, but his eyes were startlingly clear beneath the brim of his dust-covered hat. She quickly looked away when those eyes caught hers, a flush warming her cheeks. You must be Preston Quinn, Peterson said, his voice warming considerably. Heard you were coming. Your uncle's been talking about nothing else for weeks. That sounds like Uncle Ezra, the man Preston replied with a low chuckle. Man never could keep a secret. The rocking cuticus been needing a steady hand since your uncle's accident, Peterson continued. Good timing, you showing up. Francine gathered her purchases, wanting only to escape before being drawn into conversation. But as she turned to leave, her elbow caught a display of canned peaches, sending several rolling across the floor. I'm so sorry, she gasped, dropping to her knees to retrieve them. Preston Quinn was beside her in an instant, his movements fluid as he collected the scattered cans. No harm done, madam, he said, handing her the last can with a small smile. Their fingers brushed, and Francine withdrew her hand as if burned. Up close, his eyes were the deep blue of a mountain lake, kind and direct in a way that made her uncomfortable in her own skin. Thank you, she murmured, rising quickly. Mrs. Jameson is Theodore Jameson's wife, Peterson said pointedly to Preston, his tone carrying unmistakable warning. Preston's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes' recognition of the name, perhaps. Theodore Jameson's reputation stretched far beyond Miles City. Pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Jameson, Preston said, tipping his hat. Francine nodded curtly and hurried from the store, feeling his gaze follow her. Outside, she took a deep breath of the cool autumn air, steadying herself. Theodore would be expecting her home soon, and tardiness would only worsen his mood. The grand house on the hill loomed over Miles City like a sentinel, its ornate Victorian architecture a testament to Theodore's wealth and power. Francine climbed the steps to the wraparound porch with growing dread, each step heavier than the last. The house was silent when she entered, which could mean anything. She moved quietly to the kitchen, putting away her purchases with practiced efficiency. "You're late." Theodore's voice from the doorway made her stiffen. He stood there in his tailored suit, pocket watch in hand, his handsome features arranged in an expression of mild disappointment that she knew masked something far more dangerous. "I'm sorry, Theodore." "There was a small accident at the store. I don't want excuses," he interrupted smoothly, closing his watch with a snap. "The Hendersons will be here for dinner at 7. You'll wear the blue dress I bought you in Chicago." "Yes, of course," she said, keeping her voice even. Theodore approached, reaching out to touch her cheek in what might appear to be a tender gesture. Only Francine knew the threat behind it. "You'll be charming tonight," he said. "Mr. Henderson's railroad connections could be very useful to us." Us. As if she had any part in his business dealings beyond being paraded around like a trophy. "I understand," she replied. "Good." His fingers tightened briefly on her jaw before he released her. "And Francine, the Wilkins matter may come up, you know what to say." She nodded, the familiar shame burning in her stomach. The lie she'd been forced to tell that she had encouraged Theodore to acquire the Wilkins property had cemented her reputation in town as being just as ruthless as her husband. Theodore left her to prepare dinner, and Francine moved mechanically through the tasks, her mind drifting to the stranger at the general store. Preston Quinn. There had been something in his direct gaze that had stirred something long dormant inside her, a dangerous feeling she needed to extinguish immediately. The dinner with the Hendersons proceeded, as all of Theodore's business dinners did, with Francine playing the role of the perfect hostess, while Theodore charmed and manipulated. By the time their guests departed, her face ached from maintaining her smile, and Theodore was in high spirits, pouring himself another brandy in his study. "Come here," he commanded, and Francine obediently approached his desk. "Henderson is practically begging to invest in our venture." "You did well tonight." "Thank you," she said, knowing praise often preceded punishment with Theodore. "Though I noticed you barely touched your dinner," he continued, his tone sharpening. "Mrs. Henderson commented on it. Do you find my hospitality lacking, Francine?" "No, Theodore. I just wasn't very hungry." The slap came without warning, not hard enough to leave a visible mark but enough to silence her. "Your behavior reflects on me," he said calmly, returning to his brandy. "Remember that. You may go." Upstairs in her bedroom they had separate rooms. A small mercy Francine changed into her nightgown with trembling hands. 4 years of marriage to Theodore had taught her that this was her life now, so different from the dreams she'd had as a young girl. The daughter of a struggling rancher, she'd been flattered by the attention of the handsome, wealthy businessman. Her father had practically pushed her into Theodore's arms, relieved to have one less mouth to feed. By the time she'd discovered Theodore's true nature, it was too late. In the eyes of the law and society, she was his property, with nowhere to run and no one to turn to. She went to the window, gazing out at the vast Montana night. Somewhere out there was the rocking Q Ranch, where a man with kind eyes was probably settling in for his first night. She pushed the thought away. Dreams and wishes were dangerous things. Preston Quinn rode out to the rocking Q at dawn the next morning, the mountains to the west still shrouded in purple shadow. His uncle's ranch sprawled across 5,000 acres of prime grazing land, built by Ezra Quinn's sweat and determination over 30 years. He found the old man on the porch, his broken leg propped up on a stool, scowling at the horizon. "About time you showed your face," Ezra grumbled, though his eyes lit up at the sight of his nephew. "Been waiting since sunrise." Preston dismounted, tying his horse to the rail. "Some of us were actually working, old man. Checked the north pasture fence line before heading back. And needs work. I'll take some of the boys up there tomorrow." Ezra nodded approvingly. "You always did have a good head on your shoulders, not like your fool father, God rest his soul." Preston smiled at the familiar jab. His father and Ezra had been as different as two brothers, could be one a dreamer who'd chased gold strikes across the West, the other a pragmatist who'd built something lasting. "Met an interesting woman in town yesterday," Preston said, pouring himself coffee from the pot warming on the porch stove. "Mrs. Jameson." Ezra's expression darkened, Theodore Jameson's wife, you stay clear of that whole situation, boy. What situation? Preston asked, leaning against the porch rail. Peterson at the store acted strange when she came in, felt like the temperature dropped 10 degrees. Ezra sighed, setting down his coffee mug. Theodore Jameson's the most powerful man in Miles City and the most dangerous. Came here about 5 years back, started buying up land businesses. Man's got his fingers in everything from cattle to mining interests. His wife. He shook his head. She's cut from the same cloth by all accounts. She didn't seem like appearances deceive, boy. That woman helped Jameson drive good folks off their land. The Wilkins family had a small spread bordering Jameson's property. Word is she befriended Sarah Wilkins, learned all about their financial troubles, then used that information so Jameson could swoop in and take everything. Preston frowned. The woman he'd met, with her downcast eyes and careful movements, didn't match this description at all. That doesn't sound right. It's gospel truth in Miles City, Ezra insisted. She's as cold-blooded as her husband, 2 peas in a pod. You do well to steer clear. But as Preston rode out with the ranch hands later that morning, he couldn't reconcile his uncle's words with what he'd observed. The bruise he'd glimpsed on Francine Jameson's wrist, carefully hidden beneath her cuff. The way she'd flinched when he'd moved too quickly to help her. The shadow of fear that darkened her eyes when Peterson mentioned her husband. Preston Quinn had spent enough years breaking wild horses to recognize the look of something trapped. 3 days later, Francine rode her mare along the creek that marked the southern boundary of the Jameson property. These solitary rides were her only freedom, grudgingly permitted by Theodore as long as she returned by a specified time. Today, with Theodore away in Billings on business, she had allowed herself to venture farther than usual. The autumn day was glorious, the cottonwoods along the creek blazing gold against the clear blue sky. For a brief, precious time, Francine could pretend she was free, that the girl who had once dreamed of adventure still existed somewhere inside her. The sound of hoofbeats made her tense, her momentary peace shattered. She reined in her mare, considering whether to flee back toward home, when Preston Quinn rode into view around a bend in the creek. He pulled up short when he saw her, surprise evident on his face before he touched the brim of his hat in greeting. "Mrs. Jameson." "Mr. Quinn," she acknowledged, her hands tightening on the reins. "Beautiful day for a ride," he commented, his gaze taking in her riding habit one of the few pleasures Theodore allowed her, as he enjoyed showing off his well-equipped wife to other landowners. "Yes, it is," she replied, uncertain why she wasn't already turning to leave. Something about his direct, uncomplicated manner made her want to linger, despite the danger. "I'm checking fence lines," he explained, gesturing toward the tools attached to his saddle. "Creek marks the boundary between the rocking queue and your husband's property." "I know," she said. The acquisition of the land they were currently on had been one of Theodore's first expansions after their marriage. A silence fell between them, not entirely uncomfortable. Preston's horse, a magnificent buckskin gelding, dipped its head to drink from the creek. "Your mare's a beauty," Preston said finally. "Arabian?" "Yes," Francine replied, patting the horse's sleek neck. "Her name is Willow. Suits her." His smile was warm, genuine in a way she rarely encountered. "You ride well." "Thank you." The compliment, simple as it was, brought unexpected warmth to her cheeks. "I've loved riding since I was a girl. My father had a small ranch north of here." "The Thompson place?" Preston asked. "You know it. Passed by it on my way to Miles City. Looks like it's seen better days." Francine's heart sank. After her mother died and she married Theodore, her father had turned increasingly to drink. The last she'd heard, the ranch was failing badly. Theodore had forbidden any contact, cutting her off completely from her old life. "I haven't been back in years," she admitted quietly. Something in her tone must have revealed more than she intended, because Preston's expression softened with understanding. "Family can be complicated," he said simply. A distant church bell from town rang the hour, startling Francine. "I should go," she said hurriedly, gathering her reins. "Good day, Mr. Quinn." She turned Willow toward home, but Preston's voice stopped her. "Mrs. Jameson." When she looked back, his expression was serious. "If you ever need anything, the rocking queue is just over that ridge." The offer hung in the air between them, its meaning clear despite its ambiguity. Francine felt a surge of panic had he somehow seen through her carefully constructed facade. Was this a trap? I don't know what you mean, she said stiffly. Just being neighborly, Preston replied, his steady gaze suggesting otherwise. Francine rode away without another word, her heart pounding. Such a dangerous interaction. If Theodore ever found out she'd spoken to Preston Quinn alone, the consequences would be severe. Yet she couldn't deny the flutter of something like hope that had awakened in her chest at his words. Over the next 2 weeks, Francine found herself riding to the creek more often than was prudent. Sometimes Preston was there, working on fences or moving cattle. Their conversations remained brief, superficial, yet each one felt like drawing breath after being underwater. Preston never again made reference to his offer of help, but sometimes she would catch him looking at the fading bruise on her wrist, or noticing when she winced as she dismounted her horse, her ribs still tender from Theodore's latest outburst. He never commented, but his eyes grew darker, his jaw tightening in a way that should have frightened her but instead made her feel strangely protected. She learned that he had spent years working ranches across the territory before coming to help his uncle. That he had fought briefly in the final year of the war, though he was just 16 at the time. That his laugh could transform his weathered face into something boyish and carefree. In turn, she shared small, safe truths: her love of books, memories of her mother teaching her to bake bread, how she missed having a garden of her own. Theodore considered her interest in growing things beneath their station, employing a gardener instead for the showy ornamental beds around their house. These brief encounters became precious to Francine, dangerous as they were. But reality always waited at home, where Theodore's business dealings were taking a troubling turn. The railroad's planning a spur line, Theodore announced one evening as Francine served his dinner. It'll transform shipping for the whole region. That's wonderful news, she replied automatically. It will be once I secure the right parcels, he continued, cutting into his steak. The rocking queue stands in the way. Francine nearly dropped the serving dish. Ezra Quinn's ranch. Theodore's eyes narrowed at her reaction. You know of it. I've heard the name, she said carefully. It's a large operation, isn't it? Too large for an old man with a broken leg, Theodore said dismissively. I've made him a fair offer. And if he doesn't accept, the question slipped out before she could stop herself. Theodore set down his knife and fork, studying her with cold precision. Since when do you take an interest in my business affairs, Francine? I know how important this is to you, she backpedaled, heart racing. Indeed. He returned to his meal, though his gaze remained suspicious. Quinn is a stubborn old fool, but every man has his price, or his weakness. The threat in his voice was unmistakable, and Francine felt sick. She knew Theodore's methods all too well. If Ezra Quinn wouldn't sell willingly, Theodore would find other means: foreclosed loans, manipulated water rights, or worse. The next day, she rode to the creek with purpose, praying Preston would be there. Relief flooded her when she saw him mending a section of fence, his horse ground tied nearby. He looked up at her approach, a smile starting to form before he saw her expression. Mrs. Jameson, what's wrong? Francine dismounted quickly, glancing around to ensure they were alone. Mr. Quinn, I need to warn you. My husband is planning to acquire the rocking queue for a railroad spur line. If your uncle won't sell willingly, Theodore will. She faltered, the words sticking in her throat. He'll what? Preston stepped closer, his expression grave. He'll destroy him, she whispered. He's done it before. Financial manipulation, threats, whatever it takes. The Wilkins family wasn't the first, and they won't be the last. Preston's brow furrowed. The Wilkins family? You mean the ones who I never betrayed Sarah Wilkins? Francine interrupted, the words tumbling out now that she'd started. That's what everyone believes, but it's a lie. Theodore spread that story himself, made me the villain so people would direct their anger toward me instead of him. Understanding dawned in Preston's eyes. And you've carried that blame all this time. It doesn't matter what people think of me, she said, though the pain of being ostracized by the community had been its own kind of prison. But your uncle, you need to protect him, protect the ranch. Why are you telling me this? Preston asked softly. You're putting yourself at risk. Francine looked away, unable to meet his gaze. I can't bear to watch it happen again. Not to you, to your uncle, she corrected quickly. Preston was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was low and intense. His evil was never yours to carry, Francine. The sound of her given name on his lips and the absolution in his words broke something open inside her. Tears she had held back for years threatened to spill. I should go, she said, turning quickly back to her horse. Preston caught her arm gently. Wait, thank you for the warning. But what about you? If Jameson discovers what you've done, he won't, she said with more confidence than she felt. Please, just be careful. Theodore is dangerous when crossed. So am I, Preston said quietly, and something in his tone made Francine believe him. And I protect what's mine. The possessive statement hung in the air between them, its meaning ambiguous yet charged with possibility. For one mad moment, Francine imagined what it might be like to be protected instead of controlled, to be valued instead of possessed. Goodbye, Mr. Quinn, she said, mounting her mare. This isn't goodbye, he replied with certainty. And I think it's time you called me Preston. She rode away without answering, but his words echoed in her mind all the way home. This isn't goodbye. That evening, Theodore returned home in a dark mood, slamming doors and barking orders at the housekeeper. When he entered the parlor where Francine sat with her needlework, the smell of whiskey preceded him. Ezra Quinn refuses to sell, he announced without preamble. Says the rocking queue isn't just land, it's a legacy. He spat the last word like a curse. Francine kept her eyes on her embroidery, fighting to keep her expression neutral. Perhaps another property would work for the spur line. There is no other suitable property, Theodore snapped. The rocking queue sits at the perfect junction point. He poured himself another whiskey, swirling the amber liquid. The old man's nephew arrived recently. Preston Quinn, do you know anything about him? Francine's needle froze mid-stitch, her heart hammering. No, she lied. I've heard the name mentioned in town, nothing more. Theodore studied her for a long moment, his eyes cold and assessing. Curious. Mrs. Peterson mentioned seeing you speak with him at the general store. Ice slid down Francine's spine. He helped me pick up some items I dropped. It was a brief encounter, nothing more. I see. Theodore set down his glass and approached her chair, looming over her. You know how I feel about you speaking to men without my presence, Francine. It was nothing, Theodore, truly, she said, hating the tremor in her voice. His hand shot out, gripping her chin and forcing her to look at him. I built everything we have through careful planning and strategic relationships. I won't have you undermining that with loose behavior. I would never. His grip tightened painfully. The Quinns are now my adversaries in business. You are to have no contact with them whatsoever. Is that clear? Yes, she whispered. Good. He released her roughly. I'm traveling to Helena tomorrow to meet with some investors. I'll be gone 3 days. While I'm away, you'll remain at home except for church on Sunday. Yes, Theodore, she agreed, knowing argument was pointless and dangerous. He studied her for another long moment before nodding, seemingly satisfied with her submission. I've instructed Jenkins to keep an eye on the house in my absence. Jenkins, their groundskeeper, was unquestioningly loyal to Theodore, having been with him since before their marriage. The message was clear: she would be watched. That night, alone in her room, Francine stood at the window staring toward the distant mountains. Theodore's trip presented an opportunity, but Jenkins' watchful presence made any action dangerous. And what action could she take anyway? Warning Preston about Theodore's intentions was one thing. Actually defying her husband was quite another. Yet, for the first time in years, the idea of resistance had taken root. Preston's words, his evil was never yours to carry, replayed in her mind. Was it possible that the chains binding her were partially of her own making? Fear and shame had kept her trapped as surely as Theodore's threats and controlling behavior. She thought of the rocking queue, of Ezra Quinn's determination to protect his legacy, of Preston standing firm against Theodore's manipulations. Perhaps courage, like cowardice, could be contagious. Theodore departed early the next morning, leaving Francine with a cold kiss on the cheek and a final warning about staying home. She spent the day in restless activity, acutely aware of Jenkins passing by the windows periodically, checking on her whereabouts. By evening, she had formed a plan reckless, perhaps, but necessary. Under cover of darkness, she slipped from the house through the kitchen door while Jenkins was making his rounds at the front of the property. Dressed in her plainest skirt and shirtwaist, with a shawl covering her distinctive blonde hair, she hurried through the back streets of Miles City toward the hotel. The night clerk looked up in surprise when she entered the lobby. "Mrs. Jameson, is everything all right?" "Yes, thank you," she said with forced calm. "I need to send an urgent telegram. My husband is away on business and there's been an important development he needs to know about." The explanation satisfied the clerk, who directed her to the telegraph office adjoining the hotel. There she quickly composed a message: Preston Quinn rocking Q Ranch, Miles City, Montana. Theodore and Helena seeking investors to pressure sale. Plans legal action upon return. Documents in study safe. Combination 182407. Evidence of prior dealings may help your case. Be careful. She hesitated before signing, then simply wrote F at the bottom. The telegraph operator raised an eyebrow at the content, but asked no questions as she paid the fee. Message sent. Francine slipped back into the night, her heart racing with the enormity of what she'd done. If Theodore ever discovered her betrayal, the consequences would be severe, possibly fatal. But for the first time in years, she had acted according to her own conscience rather than her husband's will. She returned home without being discovered, though sleep eluded her. The die was cast. She could only wait to see what morning would bring. Preston received the telegram just after dawn. He read it twice, then handed it to his uncle across the breakfast table. "Well, I'll be damned," Ezra said, whistling low. "Theodore Jameson's own wife." "She's not what people think," Preston said quietly. Ezra studied his nephew's face. "You've met her before, haven't you? More than just passing in town." Preston nodded. "She warned me about Jameson's plans a few days ago, risked a lot to do it. Must have her reasons," Ezra mused. "You thinking of taking her up on this? Breaking into Jameson's house is a hanging offense if we're caught." "Not breaking in if we have a key," Preston said, producing a small brass key from his pocket. "Francine dropped this when she was gathering those cans at the store. Figured it might be important, so I held on to it. House key by the look of it. Convenient," Ezra remarked, raising a bushy eyebrow, "almost like she planned it." "Maybe she did," Preston acknowledged. "Either way, if Jameson has documents that prove he's been operating outside the law, we need that evidence." Ezra leaned back in his chair, wincing as he adjusted his broken leg. "You sure this isn't about something else, boy, like a pretty blonde with sad eyes?" Preston's jaw tightened. "I've seen the bruises, Uncle Ezra, the way she flinches when someone moves too quick. Whatever's between her and Jameson, it isn't right." "No," Ezra agreed soberly. "I reckon it isn't, but that doesn't make this any less dangerous." "Danger doesn't bother me," Preston said. "Injustice does." That night, with most of Miles City settled in for the evening, Preston made his way to the Jameson house on the hill. The Grand Victorian stood dark except for a single light in what must be the kitchen. Moving silently, he approached the side door, relieved when Francine's key slid smoothly into the lock. Inside, the house was silent and oppressive despite its lavish furnishings. Preston moved carefully through the dim hallways, following Francine's directions to Theodore's study at the back of the house. The safe was exactly where she had described, hidden behind a painting of Theodore himself, standing proudly before the Miles City bank he partially owned. The combination worked on the first try. Inside, Preston found ledgers, land deeds, and correspondence that confirmed what Francine had implied. Theodore Jameson had been systematically destroying his competitors through a combination of fraud, blackmail, and occasionally outright threats. The Wilkins family had been particularly ill-treated, with evidence that Theodore had bribed officials to deny them water rights, eventually forcing them to sell at a fraction of their land's value. Preston was gathering the most damning documents when he heard a floorboard creak in the hallway. He froze, one hand going to the revolver at his hip. "It's just me," came Francine's whispered voice as she slipped into the study. She was dressed in a simple dark dress, her hair loose around her shoulders. "Jenkins is asleep. I put laudanum in his evening coffee." "That was risky," Preston said, but couldn't help a small smile of admiration. Everything about this is risky, she replied, approaching the safe. Did you find what you needed? Enough to hang Jameson 10 times over, Preston confirmed, showing her the documents. Evidence of fraud, bribery, even blackmail. Francine nodded grimly. There's more. She reached past him into the safe, removing a false bottom to reveal another compartment containing a small leather-bound book, his private journal. It details everything, including plans for dealing with your uncle if he continues to refuse the sale. Preston took the journal, leafing through pages of neat, precise handwriting. This is exactly what we need to stop him. Taking it is one thing, Francine said. Using it is another. Theodore has the sheriff and judge in his pocket. Not the federal marshal, Preston countered. These documents show interstate fraud. That puts it under federal jurisdiction. Francine's eyes widened with hope, then clouded. Even if this works, even if Theodore is arrested, where does that leave me? I have no money of my own, no property. In the eyes of the law, everything belongs to my husband. Preston stepped closer, fighting the urge to take her hands in his. Come with me, he said impulsively, to the rocking queue. You'll be safe there while this plays out. I can't, she whispered, though the longing in her voice was unmistakable. If I disappear the same night these documents do, everyone will know I helped you. Theodore would use that to discredit everything, claim you coerced his wife into stealing from him. Then what? I leave you here to face him when he returns. Francine straightened her shoulders. I've faced him for 4 years. I can manage 3 more days. She touched the journal in his hands. But you need to act quickly. Theodore returns on Friday. A sound from elsewhere in the house made them both tense. You should go, Francine urged. Take the servants' stairs at the end of the hall. They lead to the back garden. Preston hesitated, reluctant to leave her. Francine, if he hurts you, he won't have the chance, she promised. Not after you've done what needs to be done. Their eyes held for a long moment, unspoken feelings passing between them. Then Preston tucked the documents inside his coat and moved to the door. This isn't over, he said softly. No, she agreed, a new determination in her gaze. It's just beginning. The next day passed in agonizing slowness for Francine. She moved through her usual routines, hyper-aware of Jenkins watching the house, terrified that at any moment Theodore might return early and discover what she had done. By evening, her nerves were stretched to breaking point. As darkness fell, a commotion in town drew her to the front windows. Lanterns bobbed in the distance, voices raised in excitement. Something was happening on Main Street. Jenkins appeared at the front door, his face troubled. Mrs. Jameson, there seems to be some disturbance in town. I should go see what's happening. Of course, she agreed, maintaining a calm facade despite her racing heart. Please do. The moment he was gone, Francine rushed to pack a small valise with essential items. Whatever Preston had done with the documents, she knew her time in this house was limited. Theodore would suspect her involvement immediately. She had just finished gathering her few personal treasures, her mother's locket, a book of poetry, the small sum of money she had managed to hide away over the years when hoofbeats approached the house. Looking out, she saw Preston dismounting in the front yard, alongside a stern-looking man wearing a federal marshal's badge. Francine hurried downstairs, opening the door before they could knock. What's happened? She asked, though she could guess from Preston's triumphant expression. Mrs. Jameson, the marshal greeted her formally. I'm Federal Marshal Robert Harding. I'm here to inform you that your husband, Theodore Jameson, has been arrested on multiple charges of fraud, corruption, and intimidation. The evidence was quite compelling. Relief made her legs weak. I see. The marshal sent a telegram to Helena, Preston explained. Theodore was arrested at his hotel this afternoon. He'll be brought back to Miles City tomorrow for a preliminary hearing, the marshal continued. Given the circumstances, I thought it prudent to inform you personally. These matters can get complicated. Thank you, Francine managed. What happens now? That depends partly on you, madam, Marshal Harding said. Your husband's assets will be frozen pending investigation. As his wife, your legal position is somewhat precarious. She had no knowledge of Jameson's criminal activities, Preston interjected firmly. In fact, she's been a victim of his abuse for years. The marshal's eyes softened slightly. Be that as it may, Mrs. Jameson, you might want to consider staying elsewhere until this matter is resolved. Jameson has made enemies, and some might direct their anger toward you. She's coming to the rocking queue, Preston said before Francine could respond. My Uncle Ezra has already prepared a room. Francine looked at Preston in surprise. I couldn't impose, it's not an imposition, he said quietly. It's protection. For a moment she wavered. To leave this house, to openly defy Theodore by staying with the Quinns, it was the final, irrevocable step. But looking at Preston's steady gaze, she found her resolve. I'll need a few minutes to gather my things, she said. The marshal nodded. I'll wait here with Mr. Quinn. Upstairs, as she added the last few items to her valise, Francine felt a curious lightness. For 4 years, these walls had been her prison. Now, with a few simple actions, she was walking free. The future remained uncertain. Theodore might yet evade justice, might yet reclaim control over her life, but for tonight, at least, she had chosen her own path. When she descended the stairs, Preston was waiting alone in the foyer, the marshal having stepped outside. Are you sure about this? She asked. Taking me to the rocking queue could make things difficult for you and your uncle. We're already in Theodore's crosshairs, Preston replied. Besides, Uncle Ezra's taken quite an interest in your situation since I told him the truth. Says he owes you a debt for the warning. I don't want anyone's charity, Francine said, lifting her chin. Good, Preston smiled. Because Ezra Quinn doesn't believe in charity, believes in justice, though, and second chances. He took her valise, his fingers brushing hers in a touch that felt deliberate. Ready. Francine took one last look around the grand entryway with its cold marble and imposing portraits. Yes, she said. I'm ready. Outside, the marshal had brought a buggy for Francine, while Preston rode alongside on his buckskin. As they left the hill and passed through town, Francine felt the weight of stares from late-night stragglers on the boardwalks. They're all looking, she murmured. Let them, Preston said. About time they saw the truth instead of Theodore's lies. The ride to the rocking queue took nearly an hour, the ranch house finally appearing as a warm glow of lamplight against the vast darkness of the Montana night. As they approached, the front door opened, and Ezra Quinn stood silhouetted against the light, leaning on his crutch. About time you got back, he called to Preston. Mrs. Jameson, welcome to the rocking queue. It's not as fancy as what you're used to, but it's solid. Francine descended from the buggy, suddenly shy in the face of the old rancher's scrutiny. Thank you for having me, Mr. Quinn. I know this is an unusual situation. Call me Ezra, he replied, stepping back to let her enter. And there's nothing unusual about helping a neighbor in need. That's the code out here. Inside, the ranch house was warm and inviting, with simple, sturdy furniture and walls adorned with cattle brands and old photographs. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, and the smell of coffee and something baking filled the air. Maria, our housekeeper, insisted on making fresh bread when she heard you were coming, Ezra explained, gesturing toward the kitchen where a plump woman with silver-streaked black hair was wiping her hands on her apron. She doesn't speak much English, but she understands kindness in any language. Gracias, Maria, Francine said, summoning her limited Spanish. El pan huel maravilloso. Maria beamed, replying in rapid Spanish that Francine couldn't entirely follow, but the warmth was unmistakable. Marshal Harding declined to stay, needing to return to town to prepare for Theodore's arrival the next day. I'll keep you informed of developments, Mrs. Jameson, he promised as he left. Try not to worry. The evidence against your husband is substantial. After he'd gone, Ezra showed Francine to a comfortable bedroom at the back of the house. It was my sister's room when she visited, he explained. Been empty too long. Does an old bachelor good to have a woman's touch around the place again. Left alone, Francine sat on the edge of the bed, overwhelmed by the day's events. For so long, she had lived in fear, believing there was no escape from Theodore's control. Now, suddenly, she found herself free temporarily, at least, and surrounded by people who seemed genuinely concerned for her welfare. A soft knock at the door roused her from her thoughts. Preston stood there, holding a mug of something steaming. Maria insisted you needed this, he said, offering the mug. Hot chocolate, Apparently it cures everything from broken hearts to broken spirits. Francine accepted it gratefully, the rich aroma bringing back childhood memories. Thank you for everything. Preston leaned against the doorframe, keeping a respectful distance. You're the one who took the risk, Francine. Without your warning, without the evidence you helped me find, Jameson would still be free to terrorize this town. It doesn't feel real yet, she admitted. That he might actually face consequences for his actions. It's real, Preston assured her. The marshal is confident the charges will stick. Even if some local officials are in Theodore's pocket, the federal court isn't. Francine sipped the chocolate, letting its warmth spread through her. And what happens to me? Even if Theodore goes to prison, legally I'm still his wife. There are options, Preston said carefully. Divorce is possible, especially with evidence of cruelty. And if Theodore's assets are seized as proceeds of criminal activity, the court might make provisions for you. You seem to know a lot about legal matters for a cowboy, she observed. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. My father wanted me to be a lawyer before I ran off to join the army. Made me study enough that some of it stuck. His expression grew serious again. Whatever happens, Francine, you're not alone in this anymore. The simple statement brought unexpected tears to her eyes. I've been alone for so long, she whispered, even before Theodore. My mother died when I was 16, and my father, he saw me as a burden, a mouth to feed. When Theodore showed interest, my father practically pushed me into the marriage. And now, Preston asked quietly. Francine looked up, meeting his steady gaze. Now I'm terrified and hopeful, both at once. That sounds about right, he acknowledged with a small smile. Courage isn't about not being afraid, it's about being afraid and moving forward anyway. Is that cowboy wisdom? She asked, returning his smile. Nope, that one's all mine. He straightened from the doorframe. You should rest. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges. Preston, she called softly as he turned to leave. When he looked back, she said simply, Thank you for believing me when no one else did. His expression softened. Some things you just know in your gut, Francine. Good night. Good night, she whispered as he closed the door. Sleep came easier than Francine had expected. The exhaustion of the day combined with the unaccustomed feeling of safety allowing her to truly rest for the first time in years. She woke to sunlight streaming through unfamiliar curtains and the distant sounds of ranch life, cattle lowing, men calling to each other, the rhythmic chopping of firewood. For a moment, disorientation gripped her. Then the events of the previous day came rushing back, and with them, a strange mixture of dread and exhilaration. Theodore would be returning to Miles City today, in custody, but no less dangerous for that. Dressing quickly in her simplest day dress, Francine made her way to the kitchen where she found Maria kneading dough at a large wooden table. The housekeeper greeted her warmly in Spanish, gesturing toward a pot of coffee and a plate of eggs and bacon keeping warm on the stove. Gracias, Francine said, helping herself to breakfast. Where are Mr. Quinn and Preston? Maria's reply was too rapid for Francine's limited Spanish, but she gathered from the gestures that Ezra was in his study and Preston was out with the cattle. As if summoned by his name, Ezra appeared in the doorway, his broken leg making his progress slow but determined. Morning, Mrs. Jameson, he greeted her. Sleep well. Better than I have in years, she admitted. And please call me Francine. Ezra eased himself into a chair at the table. Francine, then. Preston rode out at dawn to move some cattle from the north pasture, should be back by midday. He studied her over his coffee cup. Marshal Harding sent word. Your husband arrived in town an hour ago. The hearing is set for 2 o'clock. Francine's appetite vanished. I see. The marshal thinks your testimony could be valuable, Ezra continued, if you're willing to speak about Jameson's business practices and his treatment of you. Of course, Francine said automatically, though the thought of confronting Theodore, of speaking publicly about the private hell of her marriage, filled her with dread. Ezra must have read her expression. It's not an easy thing laying bare your wounds for strangers to judge, he said gently. No one would think less of you if you chose not to. Wouldn't they? Francine set down her coffee cup. The entire town already thinks I'm Theodore's willing accomplice. If I don't speak now, that belief will never change. Do you care what the town thinks? Ezra asked shrewdly. Francine considered the question. I care about the truth, she said finally. For too long I've lived Theodore's lies. Even if it's difficult, I want to reclaim my own story. Ezra nodded approvingly. Preston said you had steel in your spine. Good to see he was right. The mention of Preston brought warmth to Francine's cheeks. He's been very kind. Kind isn't the word I'd use, Ezra replied with a knowing look. That boy's been half in love with you since the first time he saw you in Peterson's store. Never seen him take to someone so quick. Francine's heart quickened at the casual observation. I'm still married, she reminded him and herself. For now, Ezra agreed. But life has a way of opening new doors just when you think all of them are closed. Preston returned just before noon, dust-covered and tired from the morning's work. His face brightened visibly when he saw Francine helping Maria prepare lunch, her sleeves rolled up and flour dusting her cheeks. Looks like you're settling in, he remarked, washing his hands at the pump by the door. Maria's teaching me to make proper tortillas, Francine explained. Though I think I'm a slow student. Maria said something in Spanish that made Preston laugh. She says you have good hands for cooking, just no patience. Francine smiled ruefully. She's right about that. Theodore always had a French chef. I haven't cooked a proper meal in years. Well, you've got time to learn now, Preston said, his tone casual but his eyes conveying deeper meaning. Over lunch, they discussed the upcoming hearing. Preston would accompany Francine to town while Ezra remained at the ranch, his broken leg making the journey difficult. The marshal will escort you into the courthouse, Preston explained. Jameson will be there in custody. The judge will review the evidence and determine if there's enough to bind him over for trial. And if there is, Francine asked. Then he stays in jail until the circuit judge arrives next month unless he can post bail. Which he almost certainly can, she concluded grimly. Theodore has money hidden away, connections in every bank from here to Chicago. Maybe, Preston conceded. But he won't be able to touch you, Francine. Not anymore. The marshals requested a restraining order as part of the proceedings. It was a small comfort, but still, the thought of facing Theodore after her betrayal made Francine's stomach clench with anxiety. What would she see in his eyes when he realized what she had done? The cold fury she knew so well would be there, certainly, but also disbelief that his quiet, obedient wife had finally found the courage to defy him. As the time for the hearing approached, Francine changed into her best dress, a modest blue taffeta that had always been Theodore's favorite. A small act of defiance, wearing it now to witness his downfall. Preston was waiting for her on the porch, his usually casual attire replaced by a clean black suit and string tie. He'd clearly made an effort to look respectable for the court, and the transformation was striking. The rugged cowboy was still evident in his sun-browned face and calloused hands, but there was an air of quiet dignity about him that Francine found deeply appealing. You look beautiful, he said simply as she joined him. Thank you, she replied, suddenly shy. You clean up rather well yourself. The ride to town was mostly silent, each lost in their own thoughts about what lay ahead. As they approached Miles City, Francine could feel curious eyes turning their way. News of Theodore's arrest had clearly spread, and the sight of his wife arriving with Preston Quinn only added fuel to the gossip. Marshal Harding met them at the courthouse steps. Mrs. Jameson, Mr. Quinn, he greeted them formally. The judge is ready to begin. Mrs. Jameson, if you'll come with me, there's a waiting room where you can remain until called to testify. Preston squeezed her hand briefly. I'll be right there in the courtroom, he promised. The waiting room was small and sparse, with only a wooden bench and a small window overlooking the street. Francine sat rigidly, listening to the muffled sounds from the courtroom next door. She couldn't make out individual words, only the rise and fall of voices, the prosecutor presenting evidence, witnesses being called. An hour passed before a deputy appeared to summon her. Judge is ready for you now, madam, he said. The courtroom fell silent as Francine entered. It seemed as if half the town had crowded in to witness the proceedings. At the front, Theodore sat between two deputies, his hands manacled before him. He looked smaller somehow, his usual commanding presence diminished by captivity. Then his eyes found her, and the cold hatred in his gaze made her falter mid-step. The deputy escorted her to the witness stand, where she took the oath with a trembling hand. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed man named Dawson, approached. "Mrs. Jameson, thank you for coming today. I understand this must be difficult for you." Francine nodded, unable to look away from Theodore's burning glare. "Mrs. Jameson, can you tell the court about your husband's business dealings, particularly regarding the Wilkins family property?" Taking a deep breath, Francine began to speak. Haltingly at first, then with growing confidence, she described what she knew of Theodore's manipulations, the bribes to officials, the threats to competitors, the careful construction of his image as Miles City's most prominent citizen, while he systematically crushed anyone who stood in his way. "And what about his treatment of you, Mrs. Jameson?" Dawson asked gently. Francine hesitated, aware of the crowded courtroom hanging on her every word. To speak of private pain in such a public setting felt impossible. Then her eyes found Preston, sitting in the back row, his steady gaze giving her strength. "My husband is a violent man," she said clearly. "He has beaten me regularly throughout our marriage. He controls every aspect of my life, where I go, who I speak to, what I wear." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Theodore's lawyer objected, claiming her personal grievances were irrelevant to the charges at hand, but the judge overruled him. "And the story that you helped your husband acquire the Wilkins property through deception," Dawson prompted. "A lie," Francine stated firmly. "Spread by Theodore himself to direct public anger toward me instead of him. Sarah Wilkins was my friend. I tried to warn her family, tried to help them, but Theodore discovered my interference and—" She faltered, remembering the punishment that had followed. "Take your time, Mrs. Jameson," the judge said kindly. Francine squared her shoulders. "He made sure I understood that any defiance would be severely punished, and he made sure the town believed I was complicit in his schemes." When it came time for cross-examination, Theodore's lawyer tried to paint her as a vindictive wife seeking revenge, suggesting she had fabricated evidence to frame her husband. But Francine remained steady, answering each accusation with calm dignity. Finally, she was allowed to step down. As she passed Theodore, he whispered, "You'll regret this," so low only she could hear. The judge's decision came swiftly. The evidence was sufficient to bind Theodore over for trial on multiple federal charges. Bail was set at an amount that, while substantial, Theodore could likely manage to pay. "However," the judge added, "given the nature of some allegations made today, I am issuing a restraining order barring Mr. Jameson from any contact with his wife pending resolution of these matters." Outside the courthouse, Preston was waiting. "You did well in there," he said, his admiration evident. "That took courage. He'll make bail," Francine said, glancing back at the courthouse doors. "He'll be free by morning." "But not free to hurt you," Preston reminded her. "The restraining order is just a piece of paper," she interrupted. "Theodore doesn't respect any law that inconveniences him." Preston's expression hardened. "Then we'll make sure you're safe by other means." He offered his arm. "Let's go home." Home. Such a simple word, yet it stirred something profound in Francine's chest. The rocking queue wasn't her home, not really, but in that moment, the prospect of returning there with Preston felt right in a way nothing had in years. As they walked toward their horses, a figure stepped from the shadow of a nearby building. Mr. Peterson from the general store. The elderly shopkeeper approached hesitantly, his usual stern expression replaced by something like regret. "Mrs. Jameson," he said, removing his hat. "I wanted to. Well, to apologize. What you said in there about the Wilkins family, I should have known better than to believe the rumors." Francine was momentarily speechless. After years of cold shoulders and whispered accusations, this simple acknowledgement of her truth felt momentous. "Thank you, Mr. Peterson," she managed finally. "That means a great deal to me. You always were kind to my Martha when she was ailing," the shopkeeper continued, referring to his late wife. "Brought her those preserves, sat reading to her. Doesn't square with the woman they said helped ruin the Wilkins." He cleared his throat awkwardly. "Anyway, you're welcome in my store anytime, Mrs. Jameson, and if there's anything you need while this business sorts itself out." "That's very kind," Francine said, genuinely touched. As Peterson walked away, Preston squeezed her hand. "That's just the beginning," he said. "The truth has a way of changing things." That evening at the rocking queue, they gathered in Ezra's study to discuss what came next. Theodore had indeed posted bail as expected and would be released in the morning. "The trial won't start for at least a month," Ezra said, reviewing the notes Preston had made. "Until then, Francine needs to decide her next steps." "I could go to my father's ranch," she suggested half-heartedly. "Though I'm not sure of my welcome there." "You could," Preston agreed, "or you could stay here." Ezra cleared his throat meaningfully. "I think what my nephew is trying to say in his clumsy way is that you have a place here for as long as you want it." "I couldn't impose indefinitely," Francine protested. "It's not an imposition," Preston said quietly. "You saved this ranch when you warned us about Theodore's plans. Besides, Maria has already decided you belong here. She's planning to teach you to make empanadas tomorrow." Francine smiled despite herself. "She's very determined, runs in the family," Ezra remarked, giving Preston a significant look. "Speaking of family, Preston tells me your father's place is struggling. Might be worth a visit, mending fences there." The suggestion struck a chord in Francine. She hadn't seen her father in 4 years, Theodore having effectively isolated her from her former life. What would it be like to return now to try to rebuild that relationship? "I'll think about it," she promised. The next few days settled into an unexpectedly pleasant rhythm. Francine helped Maria with household tasks, learning cooking skills that had been denied her in Theodore's household with its formal staff. She rode out with Preston occasionally to check fence lines or move cattle, discovering a quiet joy in these simple shared activities. The restraining order seemed to be working. Theodore made no attempt to approach her, though she sometimes felt watched when she ventured into town. The court had frozen many of his assets pending trial, allowing Francine access only to a small monthly stipend for necessities. A week after the hearing, Francine decided it was time to visit her father. Preston insisted on accompanying her, despite her protests that she could manage alone. "I'd feel better being there," he said simply. "Besides, I've been curious about the Thompson place since I rode past it." They set out early, the journey taking them north along winding trails through rolling grassland. The landscape grew increasingly familiar to Francine as they approached her childhood home, memories surfacing with each landmark they passed. The Thompson Ranch came into view around midday, a small, weathered house with a barn and corral, nestled in a shallow valley beside a meandering creek. Even from a distance, Francine could see the signs of neglect: broken fence rails, an unmended roof, weeds growing tall around the house. "It was never much," she said apologetically to Preston, "but it used to be better kept." Preston's expression remained neutral. "Land looks good though, just needs some work." They approached the house slowly, and Francine's heart clenched when a figure emerged onto the porch, a stooped man with graying hair and a week's growth of beard. Her father. He shaded his eyes against the sun, staring at the approaching riders with suspicion until recognition dawned. "Francine." He called, disbelief in his voice. "Hello, father," she replied as they reined in before the house. Harold Thompson stared at his daughter as if seeing a ghost. "What are you doing here? Where's your husband?" The question stung, reminders of how completely she'd been defined by her marriage. "Theodore is in Miles City, awaiting trial on federal charges," she said evenly. "I'm staying at the rocking queue for now." Her father's bloodshot eyes widened, then darted to Preston. "And who might this be?" "Preston Quinn." Preston introduced himself, dismounting and extending a hand. "Ezra Quinn's nephew." Harold ignored the outstretched hand. "So you've left your husband for another man, is that it?" "Father," Francine exclaimed, dismounting quickly. "It's nothing like that. Theodore has been arrested for fraud and other crimes. I testified against him." A bitter laugh escaped Harold. "Always knew he was no good. Told you as much, didn't I? But you were too eager to escape this place, too dazzled by his fancy clothes and promises." The unfairness of the accusation struck Francine like a physical blow. "You practically forced me into that marriage," she said quietly. "You were drinking away what little money we had, and you saw Theodore as the solution to your problems." Harold's face darkened. "That's a lie. I wanted what was best for you." "You wanted what was easiest for you," Francine corrected, years of unspoken resentment finally finding voice. And then you let 4 years pass without once checking if I was safe, if I was happy. A tense silence fell. Preston moved closer to Francine, his steady presence lending her strength. Finally, Harold's shoulders slumped. "You're right," he admitted, the words seeming to cost him. "I was a coward. After your mother died, I didn't know how to be what you needed. Then Jameson came along, wealthy and charming, offering to take care of you. I told myself you'd be better off." "I wasn't," Francine said simply. Harold nodded, his eyes dropping to the porch boards. "I suspected as much the few times I saw you in town. You looked different, smaller somehow, but I convinced myself it was just the fancy life changing you." He gestured to his run-down property. "Easier than admitting I'd sent my only child into a bad situation while I stayed here drinking myself to death by inches." The raw honesty surprised Francine. She'd expected excuses, perhaps even anger, but not this blunt acknowledgement of failure. "It's not too late, you know," she said after a moment, "for either of us." Harold looked up, a flicker of hope crossing his weathered face. "What do you mean?" "I mean we can start again," Francine said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "I'm not that frightened girl anymore, and you don't have to be the man you've been these past years." Preston stepped forward. "Mr. Thompson, I couldn't help noticing your south pasture. Good grass there, going to waste. Rocking Q could use additional grazing land. Might be we could work out an arrangement, help get this place back on its feet in exchange for grazing rights." Harold studied Preston suspiciously. "Why would you do that?" "Because your daughter is a friend of the Rocking Q," Preston said simply, "and because it makes good business sense." A tentative understanding was reached that day. Harold agreed to stop drinking and work with Preston to restore the ranch, while Francine promised to visit regularly, rebuilding their relationship one careful step at a time. It wasn't forgiveness. Exactly too much hurt lay between them for that, but it was a beginning. As they rode back to the Rocking Q that evening, Francine felt lighter somehow, as if confronting her father had loosened a knot inside her that had been pulled tight for years. "Thank you for coming with me," she said to Preston, "and for what you offered my father." "It was the right thing to do," he replied, "for the ranch and for you." Francine studied his profile in the golden light of sunset. "You're a good man, Preston Quinn, better than most." He glanced at her, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Does that mean you're finally going to start calling me Preston instead of Mr. Quinn?" "I suppose it does," she laughed, realizing she'd slipped back into formality out of habit. The weeks that followed brought gradual but significant changes. Francine divided her time between the Rocking Q and her father's ranch, helping restore the latter to working condition. Harold, true to his word, stopped drinking and began rebuilding his life and his relationship with his daughter. In Miles City, attitudes toward Francine shifted as Theodore's crimes became more widely known. The preliminary evidence presented at the hearing had been just the beginning. As the marshal's investigation deepened, a pattern of corruption and intimidation emerged that had touched nearly every aspect of the town's business. More witnesses came forward, emboldened by Francine's testimony. The Wilkins family, contacted by the marshal, sent written statements from their new home in Oregon, corroborating Francine's account of events. Sarah Wilkins even wrote a personal letter to Francine, expressing regret for believing Theodore's lies and thanking her for the secret help she had provided during their difficulties. Through it all, Preston remained a steadfast presence at Francine's side, respectful of her still married status, but making his feelings increasingly clear through small gestures and quiet moments of connection. They rode together, worked together, gradually building a foundation of trust and understanding that was entirely new to Francine. One evening, as summer gave way to early autumn, they sat on the Rocking Q-Tikes porch watching a spectacular sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. Ezra had retired early, leaving them alone with their thoughts and the peaceful sounds of the ranch settling for the night. "I received a letter from my lawyer today," Francine said, breaking the comfortable silence. "He believes the divorce petition will be granted, given the circumstances." "Theodore is fighting it, of course." "Of course," Preston agreed. Theodore had been battling every legal action with the considerable resources still available to him, though his position grew weaker as more evidence of his crimes emerged. But he'll lose this fight just like the others. I hope so, Francine said. The trial is set to begin next week. The lawyer says I'll need to testify again. Preston reached across the space between their chairs, taking her hand. You did it once, you can do it again. She looked down at their joined hands, marveling at how natural it felt now to accept his touch, his support. Sometimes I still can't believe how much has changed in just a few months, how much I've changed. You didn't change, Francine, Preston corrected gently. You remembered who you really were. There's a difference. The insight struck her as profoundly true. The woman she was now stronger, more certain, capable of making her own choices wasn't new at all. She was the woman she might always have been, had circumstances been different. Preston, she began, then hesitated, uncertain how to express the feelings that had been growing steadily within her. Yes, he prompted, his thumb tracing small circles on the back of her hand. I need you to know that whatever happens with the trial, with the divorce, I'm grateful for everything you've done. For believing in me when even I had stopped believing in myself. His expression softened. You don't owe me gratitude, Francine. What I did because. He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. Because from the first moment I saw you in that store, I knew there was more to your story than what people said, and the more I learned, the more I. Another pause, the more I cared. The simple declaration hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning yet carefully restrained. Preston was respecting the boundaries of her situation, making his feelings known without pressing for more than she could give. I care too, Francine admitted softly. More than I thought possible. Preston's fingers tightened around hers. Then we have time to see where that leads, after everything is settled. Yes, she agreed. After. The trial of Theodore Jameson became the sensation of Miles City and beyond. Newspapers as far away as Helena and even Chicago sent reporters to cover the proceedings, fascinated by the story of the prominent businessman's downfall. Francine's testimony came on the third day. She entered the packed courtroom with Preston and Ezra flanking her, their presence giving her courage. Theodore sat at the defense table, impeccably dressed as always, his expression one of injured dignity. When Francine took the stand, his mask slipped momentarily, revealing the cold fury beneath. This time, her testimony was more comprehensive than at the hearing. She spoke for nearly 2 hours, detailing Theodore's business practices, his connections to corrupt officials, and the systematic way he had isolated and abused her throughout their marriage. Theodore's lawyer tried to discredit her, suggesting she was an unfaithful wife inventing tales to justify her abandonment of her husband. But Francine remained poised and consistent, even when the questioning grew aggressive. Mrs. Jameson, the defense attorney said with exaggerated patience, you expect this court to believe that you, an educated woman from a respectable family, remained entirely ignorant of your husband's business dealings for 4 years of marriage. Not ignorant, Francine corrected. Controlled. My husband ensured I had no access to information, no connections outside those he approved, no resources of my own. When I did learn of his activities, as with the Wilkins family, he made sure I understood the consequences of interference. And yet we have only your word for this alleged mistreatment, the lawyer pressed. No witnesses, no doctor's reports. My husband was careful, Francine replied steadily. The bruises were where clothing would hide them, the threats were made in private, the control was absolute. She met Theodore's gaze directly for the first time. That is how men like Theodore Jameson operate. They create a perfect public image while building a private hell for those under their power. A murmur ran through the courtroom at her words. Even the defense attorney seemed momentarily at a loss. When she was finally excused, Francine walked past the defense table with her head high. Theodore leaned forward as she passed, whispering, "This isn't over, Francine. Remember that." She kept walking, refusing to let him see her shiver. Outside, Preston was waiting. Without a word, he wrapped an arm around her shoulders, leading her through the crowd of spectators and reporters to where their horses waited. "Take me home," Francine said simply. The trial continued for another week, but the outcome seemed increasingly certain. Too many witnesses had come forward, too much evidence had been presented. When the jury finally returned after 2 days of deliberation, their verdict was unanimous, guilty on all counts. Theodore Jameson was sentenced to 15 years in the territorial prison, his empire of business holdings to be liquidated to compensate his victims. The judge also granted Francine's petition for divorce, ruling that Theodore's criminal conviction and the evidence of cruelty presented during the trial constituted sufficient grounds. Standing on the courthouse steps after the sentencing, Francine felt a curious emptiness. For so long, her life had been defined by her relationship to Theodore, first as his admiring bride, then as his prisoner, finally as his accuser. Now that chapter was closed forever. "What are you thinking?" Preston asked softly, standing beside her as the crowd dispersed. "That I don't know who I am now," she admitted. "Francine Jameson no longer exists, but I'm not sure who takes her place." "Whoever you want," Preston said simply. "That's the point of freedom, isn't it? The chance to choose your own path." She looked up at him, this man who had become so essential to her in such a short time. "And if the path I choose includes you," the hope that bloomed in his eyes made her heart skip, "then I'd be the happiest man in Montana territory," he said. "But Francine, I don't want to rush you. You've just regained your freedom, and I choose to share it with you," she interrupted. "Not because I need protecting or because I'm afraid to be alone, but because when I'm with you, I feel more myself than I ever have before." Preston's smile was like sunrise breaking across his face. Heedless of the remaining onlookers, he gathered her into his arms, his lips finding hers in a kiss that promised a future neither of them had dared to imagine a few months earlier. The wedding took place the following spring, when the prairie was carpeted with wildflowers, and the rocking cuticus calving season was successfully concluded. They held the ceremony in the ranch's front yard, beneath an arch of twisted willow branches that Francine and Maria had decorated with ribbons and flowers. Ezra Quinn gave the bride away, his broken leg long healed but his limp a permanent reminder of the accident that had brought Preston back to the rocking cue. Harold Thompson sat in the front row, sober and clear-eyed, his ranch slowly returning to prosperity under his renewed care and Preston's guidance. Most surprising was the turnout from Miles City. The community that had once shunned Francine now embraced her, their former judgment transformed into respect for the courage she had shown in standing against Theodore. The Petersons, the marshal and his wife, even the judge who had presided over Theodore's trial all came to celebrate this new beginning. "I never thought I'd have this," Francine whispered to Preston as they shared their first dance as husband and wife. "A real home, people who truly know me. Someone who loves me for exactly who I am." "You deserve all of it and more," he replied, his hand warm against the small of her back. "And I plan to spend the rest of my life making sure you never doubt that again." Ezra Quinn, watching them from his chair on the porch, raised his glass in a private toast. When Preston had first told him about the battered wife of Miles City's most powerful man, he'd warned his nephew to stay clear of trouble. Now, seeing the joy radiating from both their faces, he silently thanked whatever fate had brought them together. As twilight fell and lanterns were lit around the yard, casting a golden glow over the celebration, Francine found a moment of quiet at the edge of the gathering. From here, she could see the full sweep of the rocking cue, the ranch house with its welcoming lights, the barn and corrals, and beyond them the vast rolling prairie stretching toward distant mountains. Preston joined her, slipping an arm around her waist. "Having second thoughts about marrying a humble cowboy," he teased. "Never," she replied, leaning into his embrace. "Just thinking about journeys, how sometimes the longest ones happen inside us, even when we haven't gone anywhere at all. And where has your journey taken you?" He asked, his voice tender. Francine turned to face him, placing a hand against his cheek. "Home," she said simply. "It's taken me home." As the years passed, the rocking cue prospered under Preston and Francine's stewardship. When Ezra Quinn passed away peacefully in his sleep, 2 years after their wedding, he left the ranch to them with the instruction to keep building something worth passing on. They took his words to heart. The ranch expanded, incorporating Harold Thompson's adjacent property when he retired to live with them in his later years. They built a larger house to accommodate their growing family, first a son, Benjamin, born exactly 9 months after their wedding, then twins, Sarah and James, 2 years later. Francine became known throughout the region for her work with the wives and children of men like Theodore, creating a network of safe houses and resources for those seeking escape from abusive situations. The first of these safe houses was established in the old Thompson ranch house, a fitting transformation of the place where her own journey had begun. Preston's support for her work never wavered, even when some in the community muttered about interfering in private family matters. Together, they created not just a successful ranch, but a place of refuge and renewal for those who needed it most. On their 10th wedding anniversary, as they sat on their porch watching their children play in the yard, Preston presented Francine with a small wooden box. Inside was a silver locket, engraved with the words that had changed everything between them. "His evil was never yours to carry, to remind you," Preston said, fastening it around her neck. "Just in case you ever forget." "I won't forget," Francine promised, her fingers tracing the inscription. "But I'll wear it for all the women who still need to hear those words." She leaned against his shoulder, watching their children's game transform into a wild chase across the yard, their laughter carried on the warm summer breeze. The sun was setting behind the distant mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, much like the sunset on that day long ago when she had finally found the courage to claim her own heart. "I love you, Preston Quinn," she said softly. "And I love you, Francine Quinn," he replied, his arm tightening around her. "Yesterday, today, and all the tomorrows we have left." In that moment, with the ranch spread out before them and their children's laughter filling the air, Francine knew she had found not just freedom from the past, but a future richer and more joyful than she had ever dared to imagine. Theodore Jameson's evil had never been hers to carry, and in laying down that burden, she had discovered the strength to build something truly her own, a life of purpose, integrity, and abiding love. And that, she reflected as Preston's lips found hers in the gathering twilight, was the greatest victory of all.